As Dave mentioned, I'm a co-director of Freedom Agenda, and we are actually sort of a fairly new group that formed about a year ago, although we are a group continuing work that our staff and members have been doing for several years around closing Rikers. So that work has kind of lived in different containers, and Freedom Agenda is the group anchoring that grassroots work now. We're a membership organization. Our members are people who have been incarcerated or whose loved ones have been incarcerated, primarily people who've been incarcerated in the city jails and Rikers and in New York State, but other folks as well. And our overall goals as a project, as Freedom Agenda, are to advance decarceration in New York City, to be reducing the scope and scale of incarceration, to defend the human rights of incarcerated people, and to shrink the size of the criminal legal system and the jail system, and reinvest the money that has been poured into those systems into the other investments that our communities need and that we believe create safety in a much more enduring way. So the current iteration of the way that we're doing that work is through our coordinated efforts to close Rikers, and all of those goals come together in closing Rikers, reducing incarceration, addressing human rights abuses in the jails, and shrinking the size of the system overall so that we can shift where that money is going. So I have a brief presentation to give some overall overview and some visuals, and then hope that there will be a lot of time for questions, because I think that's often where we can dig into the issues that where people sort of have the most curiosity and where there's the most further explanation needed. So I'm able to share my screen, I see. So I'm going to start sharing my screen and walk through this together briefly. Okay, so everyone should be able to see my screen, and now I'm going to put this in present mode. Sorry, bear with me just a minute. Okay. So I want to start with this image just because it's important to know that the Rikers Island jails have been torturous for pretty much as long as they've been open, and there have been previous efforts to close them. Those efforts have not borne fruit yet, obviously, by the fact that the jails and Rikers are still open. The effort that Freedom Agenda has been leading, and with our members, is the first effort that's been led by formerly incarcerated people. And that's a core tenet of how our organization is oriented and founded. And we believe that that's what is going to get this done this time, is the leadership of people with lived experience. So this is also an important point to note, because sometimes the conversation about closing Rikers is misframed in the media, or even sort of in community conversations, as an initiative led by the mayor. And certainly there is no way to close Rikers without the cooperation of the mayor. So that we've been pushing this mayor, we plan to push the next mayor. But it is an effort that has been led for years by people who have survived Rikers, whose family members have been held there, and in some cases did not survive. So that is the real heart and soul of our work. And we'll move to the next slide now. So to give you a little bit of sense of sort of just what is going on in the New York City jail system and where we're at right now, and also in the context of our goals. So I mentioned our goals: decarceration, defending the human rights of incarcerated people, divestment from the system of incarceration to reinvest. And then I'll also talk about actual closures of the jails on Rikers. So starting with decarceration, we have on this screen October 2019 as a sort of the date that we're looking at, because that is the month when the plan to close Rikers was passed. So there is currently a plan to close Rikers in place that was hard fought by impacted people, Freedom Agenda's members and staff and others. Certainly the First Presbyterian Church of Brooklyn has been a huge partner in that, as well as the New York City Presbytery. So we got this legislation passed, and at that moment there were 7,235 people in the New York City jail system. When we started the efforts to close Rikers, when the campaign to close Rikers kicked off in 2016, there were actually about 11,000 people in New York City jails. So the story in New York City for a long time has been declining incarceration and increasing safety. In October 2019, as I mentioned, we were at about 7,200 people. And then you see this drop to 3,800 people in the New York City jail system by May 2020. And two things happened in between those dates, October of 2019 and May of 2020. One is that bail reform went into effect. That was a law passed at the state level. It went into effect January 2020. And it made almost all nonviolent charges and almost all misdemeanors ineligible for bail and pretrial detention. So it just shrunk the number of cases of people who could be held in jail before trial. As something that some people may already know, but just to check if people aren't familiar, Rikers as a jail primarily holds people who are awaiting trial or awaiting a parole hearing, and then a very small number of people who are serving a city sentence. So out of about 5,700 people who are there now, the number has decreased a little bit from when we did this graph. About 55, the vast majority, about more than 80%, are there pre-trial. Some people are there because they've been accused of violating a condition of their parole. Those people are also in a sense pre-trial because they're awaiting a hearing. And then there's less than 100 or about 100 people who are actually sentenced and serving a year or less. If they were sentenced to more than a year, they would go to an upstate prison. So Rikers is in a lot of ways a holding facility. So this number, dropped down because of bail reform and also because of a lot of emergency releases that were made in response to COVID-19 entering, showing up in the city jail system in March 2020 and spreading really rapidly. And so there was a moment of actual willingness by judges and district attorneys and the mayor and the governor to sort of do something to release people. And the focus was on a lot of people who were older, who were immunocompromised, or who had lower level charges. So we were able to do that. It was successful. There was, I would say actually a lot of tracking and scrutiny about what happened with the people who were released. Were they rearrested for new crimes or not? And the overwhelming evidence was that they were not. They were released and they were safer, and our communities were also safe, or were not impacted negatively in any way. What has been happening since then is that incarceration has been creeping back up. And in a jail system that was already decrepit, all of the jails on Rikers should have been closed years ago. The city was sort of anticipating a drop off in incarceration and closing those jails, but now those jails are being refilled, and that has caused a lot of the crisis that we've been seeing, and I'll get a little bit more into the details of that crisis. But I'll name just a couple of reasons for the increase in incarceration. Because it's mostly people who are pre-trial, again, it is mostly based on the decisions made by district attorneys and judges. And in that process, it is district attorneys that might be requesting that a person be held on bail, but it is still up to the judges ultimately to decide that. Unfortunately, our system often works in a way where judges function as sort of a rubber stamp on district attorneys. So the prosecution has a lot of power, but is often only looking at success as, sort of how many people they're able to prosecute or keep incarcerated. So we've seen district attorneys arguing more for higher bail, and we've seen judges more willing to grant that. There was also an effort led by really a lot of inaccurate fear mongering. I guess fear mongering is always inaccurate, but a lot of fear mongering by the New York City Police Department, trying to imply that there was an increase in crime in New York City because of bail reform laws. That claim has been thoroughly debunked. The data does not support that. There has been a really concerning increase in crime in certain areas of the city. That has also been a pattern seen across the country during COVID. It's been a pattern seen in places that did not pursue any kind of criminal justice reform or decarceration. And so the evidence is that that is much more tied to the sort of desperation that is and economic instability that has come from COVID. And much less that it's connected to any kind of reform. Nevertheless, the police commissioner continues to say that. The mayor has refused to correct him. And so it's created this environment of where DAs and judges are being more, DAs are seeking bail more often, seeking higher bail, seeking to incarcerate more people pre-trial, and judges are consenting to that. Another thing that happened in that time period is that the New York State legislature, also in response to this sort of really coordinated fear-mongering campaign and backlash against bail reform, they actually weakened some aspects of the law that went into effect January 2020. So then in July 2020, there were some rollbacks implemented. So some of the charges that had been made ineligible for pretrial detention were added back in. That has contributed a little bit to the increase in incarceration, but what's been more significant actually is just the sort of more conservative decision-making by judges and DAs about cases that were always eligible for bail, but should always, by law, have benefited from the presumption of innocence, as everyone should when they're faced with a charge. And then another thing has been extremely worsening case delays. So before COVID, cases in New York City courts took twice as long as in the rest of the state. So people were waiting, if people were incarcerated while awaiting their trial, might be on Rikers 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. That the case delays in New York City have now gotten 70% worse. And so whereas before COVID, there were about 700 people in the New York City jail system that had been there more than a year. And again, considering that these are people who have not been convicted, who are awaiting trial, that is a really long time. Now there are more than 1,500 people who have been in the city jails more than a year awaiting trial. So this backlog in the courts, and really we would characterize it as the real carelessness of the criminal legal system, that it's, just sort of willingness to postpone people's cases, not really feeling a responsibility to actually provide people a speedy trial. Something that has also been of concern to us is that during this crisis, and I actually should have started by acknowledging something that I mentioned to Charmaine when we were just chatting as I signed on. There's been tragically a report of another death in the city jails as of last night. So that brings a total to 13 people who have died in the city jails in just 9 months. That is an astronomical increase in deaths from previous years. And this should have prompted the same kind of response that we saw around the risk of COVID. The fear there was that COVID would spread through the jails and people would die. There have been far more deaths this year from just dysfunction and neglect in the jail system than there were from COVID in 2020. But it has not prompted that same willingness to release people, largely because of this really pervasive fear mongering from law enforcement about releasing people. So Mayor de Blasio has been unwilling to correct his police commissioner, although the police commissioner actually this week went to Albany, was questioned by state electeds, and had to admit on the record that the things he said about bail reform were false. So that has been truly debunked, but it doesn't, just sort of doesn't erase all of that that's out there in the atmosphere. And the mayor does have the power to directly release people who are serving city sentences. That's the only group of people that he has direct power to release. But he's been pretty unwilling to do that. So some people serving city sentences actually went to upstate prisons in the midst of this crisis. But there was willingness to do that at the beginning of COVID, and that did reduce the number of people in jail. But there's been we've seen a real unwillingness for the mayor to do that this time around, and largely because his police commissioner has spoken out against it. So you see the mayor sort of deferring to the police commissioner rather than the other way around. So there's a lot to say about decarceration, but I'll stop. I'll move on at this point, and I hope people are kind of keeping track of questions or things that you'd like to hear more about. All right, so defending the human rights of incarcerated people. The New York City jail systems have a reputation for being brutal and deadly places, and the truth is that that reputation is deserved. People in New York City jails are subjected to horrendous human rights violations, and there's a lot of things that we could say about that, but just to give a little bit of an overview. The conditions in city jails have been bad for a long time, but they have deteriorated to their worst point. And so people are not getting food, they're not getting medical care, they're not being transported to court. So rather than the purpose of jail, when a person is detained pre-trial, is supposed to guarantee that they come back to court. The justification for holding people in jail before trial is a fear that they would not show up for their court dates, which is often unfounded. In this case, the jail system that is detaining them is so dysfunctional that they are not being brought to court by that jail system. So their incarceration is actually being prolonged, in this case, not just by the courts, but also by the jail system that is failing to bring them to their court dates. And it goes on, far beyond this. People are not getting mail. They're being denied their legal right to vote because there's no real access to registration or to absentee ballots. So it goes on, but the conditions are particularly bad right now, and the starting point before this crisis was really bad. In terms of that, the starting point before that crisis, I think a helpful reference is the Nunes Federal Monitor. So in 2015, the federal government sued New York City for the conditions in the jails, essentially for exposing people to rates of violence that were deemed unconstitutional. But that exposure to use of force by staff has only increased since the Federal Monitor has been in place. So the Federal Monitor has been issuing reports for about 6 years, and the rates of force against people in custody have increased by 183%. I mentioned that these slides were made before last night, and 12 people had died in the city jails, and now that number is 9. And there was also a really important report from WNYC that showed that rates of self-harm, so people attempting suicide, had also skyrocketed. That's when those don't result in actual deaths, they're not counted as deaths, obviously, but the attempts at suicide are also, of course, really concerning. And the Legal Aid Society and Brooklyn Defender Services have recently filed another lawsuit based on the city's failure to provide medical services to people in their custody. So there is a system in place of tracking missed medical appointments, and the number of missed medical appointments in the past few months has skyrocketed. Again, it was high before this, but it has skyrocketed. So I think probably what the important thing to absorb about this overall picture is that there are egregious and widespread violations of people's human rights in the city jails right now. Divestment and reinvestment. So New York City runs the most expensive jail system in the country with the worst results. $447,000 per person per year to be held in the New York City jail system. If you compare that to other jail systems, that's about 10 times more. And it's about 10 times more because New York City has a much higher ratio of staff to people in custody than almost any other jail system. So New York's, in terms of national averages, there's about 7 times more staff per incarcerated person in the New York City jail system than the rest of the country. And that's largely happened because we looked at that graph of incarceration decreasing. So as incarceration has decreased in New York City over the last 15, 20 years, that's an incredible success that came from lots of grassroots advocacy. The number of people in jails has dropped, but the number of staff has not. So the number of people in jails has generally been going down. We mentioned this concerning uptick, but it's generally been going down, and it's much lower than it was 10 years ago, but the number of staff is still the same. So you have these outrageous costs, and if those costs translated into a wonderfully supportive environment where people were getting access to rehabilitative services and were being well cared for, maybe you could justify that cost. That is the opposite of what's happening. So again, we're paying top dollar for the worst results. The mayor has failed to rein in these escalating costs. And in this past year, actually caved to pressure from the correction officers union to hire a new class of officers, to hire 400 more guards. There had been since 2019 a hiring freeze in place because of this outrageous, sort of ratio of staff to people in custody. But around around sometime the end of last year, beginning of this year, there started to be reports of officers working triple shifts. And the union, was sort of sounding the alarm about this and saying we need to hire more officers. And the mayor caved to that. And we were saying, and a lot of other people were saying, it absolutely cannot, hiring more officers cannot be the solution. This system already has more officers for people in custody than any other system. Like, there has to be something else. And what came out more over time was that there's about a third of the workforce, of the guards, that are not showing up to work for a variety of reasons, but the system in place and the sort of lack of accountability allows them to do that. And so some people are working triple shifts, which is not, I should note, our organization agrees with, at least on one thing, with the correction officers union, that people should not be working triple shifts. It's not safe for them. It's also not safe for people in custody. Like, people are not functioning at their best when they've been working for 24 hours straight. So those triple shifts should not happen, but they won't be solved by adding more officers if there's no accountability measures in place to make sure that those officers come to work. So what we have been focusing on instead is that the need to actually ensure that there are measures in place to ensure that officers are coming to work when they are on payroll. And that seems like a really basic thing, but it's not happening right now in the New York City jail system. And this sort of more egregious, another egregious result of this in the big picture is that while all of this money is being funneled into the system, obviously, there's still really critical needs that are going unmet. And I'm sure you all see that every day in your communities, housing, healthcare, access to employment, many other things. And I'll give one very concrete example of a real frustration that we've had with this administration, and an important way that the next administration must do better. As part of the plan to close Rikers, the advocates negotiated a set of agreements to community investments. And among those community investments was an agreement to build 300 more units of what's called justice-involved supportive housing. So, like, really intensive supportive housing for people with really high level of need, either for mental health care, medical care, and people who had their history shows that they've cycled in and out of jails and emergency rooms, and sort of like frequent users of those city systems. So obviously people that are better served in a supportive housing environment than in a jail. The city issued an RFP for developing these 300 new units, but they haven't yet. Not a single one of those units has been built yet, and not a single group has been contracted to do that yet, partly because the initial contract that the city put out did not allocate enough money to actually do that work well. So while the city, sort of seems to not flinch at spending $447,000 per person per year in the jail system, there's this, sort of like penny pinching when it comes to actually paying for the services that are needed in the community. And in this case, like a combination of housing and mental health care. So I think that's just one illustrative example. And then to talk about jail closures. So, something that we're really focused on is like, are the jails on Rikers actually closing? How fast? And a lot of our advocacy is focused around getting those closed. And I will admit that this is complex because all of the jails are in really terrible condition. And in some ways, there's like a patchwork of barely functional infrastructure that is spread across all of the jails. So like EMTC has a clinic that is better formatted, but the cell doors are broken, and they only have dorms instead of individual cells, which are, dorm housing is less safe during COVID. So there's sort of this patchwork. But just to give an overview, there's 10 jails on Rikers Island. The majority of them are still open. 2 of them were slated for closure, but then were reopened in response to this rise in the jail population. again, like what we believe the mayor should have done was to be very clear with the public, to correct the lies from his police commissioner, to be very clear that we need to be decarcerating, to be very clear about the risks of incarceration, and actually how we can achieve more safety without exposing people to this kind of trauma and abuse pre-trial. So those ones in yellow, and I'll use the abbreviations for them, but you'll see the full names here. So OPCC and EMTC were slated for closure, but have been reopened. The jails that are marked in red are all ones that are still open. There is one jail, that GMDC, that's the one in blue, that was closed years ago, but it's not, we don't count it as fully closed yet unless there has been something in place to ensure that it can never be used for incarceration again. So GMDC is being used right now as a staff wellness facility. But there's, like, particularly in this concerning climate that we're seeing of rising incarceration, there's nothing that really stops the city from reopening it and saying, like, now we're going to use it for jailing people again. There is one jail out of the 10 that has been fully removed from any possibility of incarceration in the future. And we are really excited about that, because that was through the efforts of our renewable Rikers legislation that we've been working on in coalition with other groups. So that legislation is actually looking forward to what will happen with the land on Rikers after the jails are closed. And what we have landed on with our members and with environmental justice groups is this really exciting idea of being able to transform that space into a space for green infrastructure once the jails are closed. And in doing that, that would enable the closure of polluting infrastructure in the South Bronx, like in Queensbridge, in a lot of the same neighborhoods that have been so negatively impacted by incarceration and by Rikers Island. So in addition to sort of laying out an idea for right now, what that legislation includes is it's initiating 2 studies, one about how much renewable energy could be generated on the island, and then another about how wastewater could be, wastewater treatment facilities could be relocated to the island and improved in that space. And then it also includes a law that sets up a mechanism for transferring the land. So that law requires that every 6 months, starting July 1st, 2021, so in just this summer was the first date, and then every 6 months after, the city has to assess what land on Rikers Island is not being used for incarceration and transfer it from the Department of Correction to the Department of Citywide Administrative Services, and that department would coordinate these green infrastructure uses. So one of those jails, that's JATC, has been closed, transferred out of DOC control. So that's the first time in more than 100 years that any piece of Rikers Island has not been owned by the Department of Correction. And that one parcel is, is now officially never available for incarceration ever again. By law, all of the jails on Rikers need to be closed by August 31st, 2027. By that date, incarceration is prohibited on Rikers Island. That was also part of the laws passed in our efforts to close Rikers. So that end date is incredibly important to have there. But in order to get to that end date, we need to be closing these jails. We need to be reducing incarceration. We need to be moving forward on the renovation and replacement of the jails in the boroughs, which is another piece that we've been working on very closely. And we need to get these jails ultimately demolished to be able to transition this island over to something entirely different and something that can actually begin to restore harm to communities. So I'm going to pause there, even though there's more that I could say, because I think I've probably said it, lots of things that you may have questions about and things that we can dig into further. I will click to this last slide, although I can come back to it again when we close, but I just want to, sort of let everyone know how to be connected. And again, I can bring this up at the end, but the First Presbyterian Church of Brooklyn, the Justice Ministries, and the New York City Presbytery have signed on officially as endorsers of the Close Rikers campaign. We would love to have other congregations signed on and active. Dave and Jane have been participating very actively, and there's lots of opportunity for others to join us as well. So I'll note that before I stop this screen share and open up for questions.
So Dave, did you want to say anything before I started telling you questions from the chat?
No, that's what I was going to say. There is a number of questions in the chat that maybe you could address some.
Okay. So thanks so much, Sarita. That was a great run through of a very complicated and now unfortunately lengthy history about the closed Rikers movement and the de-incarceration efforts on behalf of so many different people. The first question comes in from Patrick, and he's asking, can you say a little bit more about the delays in trials that he understands that the judges are concerned about virtual court cases and would rather have in-person court cases. Do you have any comment on that?
Yeah, I can comment on that. I think that one thing that's important to understanding this overall is that it's really difficult to conduct trials virtually because of how a jury needs to convene, but 96% of cases never go to trial, partly because people are pressured into taking plea deals. So it is true that the number of trials that have been conducted since 2019 has completely dropped off. There were almost none in 2020. It's been very difficult to get them done in 2021. But that alone is not necessarily a driver of all the delays. It's also that judges are, like right now, people are not being produced to court. So someone has a court date set in which maybe their case could be settled or they could be cleared, they could be dismissed. The Department of Correction doesn't produce them to court. And then the judge says, okay, we'll adjourn in 5 weeks. Not like we'll try to find another day tomorrow, we'll try to find another time tomorrow or the next day because this person is in jail in a really deadly jail setting and we need to be trying to figure out how to move their case along. They just sort of adjourn it for however long they feel like. And it's there's this real, I think, lack of humanity within the criminal legal system where there's sort of, it's not viewed as having any real consequences to just delay someone's case indefinitely.
Thanks. And I'm sure there's some efforts that we could make to try and influence the criminal courts about changing that attitude towards keeping people incarcerated that your group can suggest to us. Patrick has another question asking about the resignations of uniformed staff. He cites a New York Times article that reported in February of 2021 that 1,000 uniformed personnel either resigned or retired during 2020. So does that, and do you want to comment on that?
Sure. Well, I think many of us, and I won't assume to know everything about the audience, so maybe there are people who have worked in corrections or have loved ones who have, but I think many of us, if we haven't worked in that job, could at least recognize it's probably a pretty unpleasant job in a lot of ways. It's certainly, I would say it's more difficult to be incarcerated, but it's not exactly an easy job to be a correction officer. So there are a lot of resignations anyway, that's always been the case, I guess I would like to say. So in 2019, when we were trying to understand, there's so many excess correction officers, the number of people in custody is dropping, but the number of staff is not. How long is it going to take just based on retirements or resignations alone to reduce that staff workforce, if a hiring freeze was implemented? We started looking into how many people, what's the rate of attrition, what's the resignations and retirements. And at that time, it was already 100 a month. So that was in 2019 before, this immediate crisis. So it's interesting that I've seen, the media reporting oh, there's a number of resignations, but what I see that they usually don't report is that's pretty much the standard rate. So it hasn't necessarily been increasing during the crisis. And I'll reiterate, what I said before, which is that the number of staff in the New York City jail system is it is such an outlier in the entire rest of the country. In fact, some of our partners at the Vera Institute of Justice did a report about this, and they do reporting across the country, and they're looking at national statistics. And they were doing a report on the cost of jails, and they said that they almost removed New York City from the analysis because it was such an outlier that it completely skewed all of the numbers. So even if you had mass resignations, there would still be there would still be absolutely enough staff to provide the services that should be provided to people in custody, but it's not happening. It's not happening, often because people aren't coming to work. It's also not happening because people, there's a really corrosive and corrupt culture in the Department of Correction. And I think that has partly developed in this in this environment of isolating people on an island, which drives this idea that it's sort of like a lawless place where correction officers set the rules and what they say goes, and it's out of sight, out of mind, and there's no oversight. So even when there are staff present, they just don't feel obligated to do the functions that they're supposed to do to provide services to incarcerated people. And those of us who have visited the jails have seen it. All of our members who have been in the jails will describe it. They'll describe, 5 officers standing around and nobody willing to take them to their visit. So it's layered, the issues there.
So a question comes in, thank you for that. So a question comes in from Sean, and I had this question too, because there was a little bit blurb of publicity about, I think it was Governor Hochul and de Blasio agreeing to move about 230 inmates to Westchester County from Rikers. And Sean would like to know your thoughts about that.
Yeah, thank you for asking. So I think what you're referring to is the news this week was actually about moving women and transgender people to the Bedford Hills Women's Prison. I was in a conversation about that yesterday with service providers, and there are a lot of concerns about that move. The Rose M. Singer Center, which is the women's jail on Rikers, has been terrible for a long time, and so getting people out of that jail is a good thing. But the intention with closing Rikers and including closing that jail has been to reduce the number of people incarcerated and then to shift a smaller number of incarcerated people to a much better setting within the city. This move to Bedford is really concerning because it further isolates women from their families, from their legal service providers. Again, I think for women, the percentage might even be higher than 80%, but the vast majority are pre-trial. And so they need to be able to get to court. They need to be able to talk to their lawyers. It's really unclear if the state system is going to make video conferencing available for lawyers, and if those video conference calls will be protected. There's sort of things that have been set up in the city jail system that haven't existed in the state system, because in the state system, people are already sentenced. So they don't need, oftentimes that kind of regular contact with lawyers. So there's a lot of concerns. One thing that there's a group called the Beyond Rosie's campaign. They've been working towards closing the Rose M. Singer Center, and what they have been advocating for is that the state has 2 empty prisons in Manhattan, and one that is sort of underutilized, which is called Edgecombe. So the 2 that are empty are Lincoln and Bayview, and then the one that's only maybe half full is Edgecombe. So those prisons had been operated in a large case as like work release facilities. So people who are finishing their sentence might be, that are from New York City, might be able to come home for the last year or so and be able to work and sort of begin to get reintegrated towards the end of their sentence. You could imagine that probably the state should be doing more of that, not less, but they have been doing less of it, which is concerning. But what it meant is that there's these sort of empty prisons in Manhattan. So the Women's Community Justice Association, through the Beyond Rosie's campaign, was advocating for the state to transfer one of those sites to the city to be used as a women's jail instead of Rosie's, and for a much smaller number of women. So reducing the, right now there's about 240 women incarcerated in New York City. People who've looked at that and analyzed all the ways that we could use alternatives and reduce that population believe that we could get that number down to less than 100 fairly soon. So rather than transferring people upstate to address this, and the Department of Correction has said that it's partly related to the current crisis on Rikers, rather than transferring people upstate, it seems that a far better move would be to district attorneys and judges to start reviewing those caseloads, start approving alternatives for people, which are available, and there's service providers willing to provide those alternatives. And then, you know, transfer one of those state-run prisons in Manhattan to the city so that there's a local site for a smaller number of incarcerated women, and they don't need to shift them upstate.
Thanks. I know when they closed the women's prison in Chelsea that, you know, there was a lot of problems that arose from families being having to travel long distances to visit their loved ones. Beverly Bartlett wants to know what you think the prospects are with Eric Adams.
A great question. You know, so as organizers, you know, we're always looking at how you know, Eric Adams is the person that needs to implement this plan. That the role of the mayor in implementing the plan to close Rikers is central. And so we are talking to city council members who can be helpful, and, you know, it's important to have them on board, but the city council is primarily going to be helpful in the way that they can push the mayor. So, you know, if the mayor really has a lot of power in this. So we're looking at how has he wanted to portray himself, and how does he want to be perceived? And how can we sort of work from that? So Eric Adams has said that he wants to close Rikers. He has said that he wants to close the pipeline that feeds Rikers, which we would agree with. He has, these are sort of the positives. You know, he said he wants to close it. He said things about you know, sort of alternative responses to violence, and investing in violence interruption, investing in early intervention for young people and schools and jobs. And those things are good. Interestingly, Eric Adams has also, you know, he spent a lot of his career sort of positioning himself as someone who took a stand against abusive policing, and someone who advocated for police reform. So we hope that we can build on that to get him to extend that to taking a stand against abuses by correction officers. But so far, that's not been the case. He sort of has this, I'm not sure exactly why, but has this sort of allegiance with the Correction Officers Union, where he has stood with them in their efforts to reinstitute solitary confinement for young adults. He's been very unwilling to criticize their abuses. He's also questioned some of the borough jail facilities, the replacement borough jail facilities, which is concerning because without that, Rikers will not close. And so when he was Brooklyn Borough president, he did actually say that he would support the effort to tear down and replace and renovate the Brooklyn House of Detention if it was developed for no more than 900 units. The capacity for incarceration was no more than 900 people. That was not where the mayor's plan started off, but in the advocacy that we did to improve that plan and the process of passing it, that was achieved. So now the Brooklyn House of Detention, the replacement facility, will have capacity for about 860 people. So Eric Adams sort of already as borough president sort of gave his approval for, you know, what the plan that's in place, but he's also publicly in some of his interviews, he's questioned, he said, well, you know, like maybe there's a need for more community input. And for people like Dave and Jane, who've been part of this for a long time, like there has been extensive community input. There have been years of community input. The community input started in 2016 with the Littman Commission, which is a citywide commission around criminal justice reform in New York City that recommended closing Rikers. That moved into land use hearings in 2018, 2019. And then a neighborhood advisory committee meetings in each borough related to that. So there's been extensive community input. And if Eric Adams tries to sort of hide behind that to stall on the plan to close Rikers, like if he's not moving it forward on day one with the speed that it needs to move, he will not meet that 2027 deadline. It will take immediate action from the day he steps into office to approve the proposals for demolition and construction of the replacement facilities. It will take his immediate efforts around reducing incarceration and sort of turning around this trend of lengthening court delays and lengthening rising incarceration rates. He's questioned bail reforms. Like he's in some ways been willing to echo some of those same falsehoods from the police department, which has been confusing. So I would say, like, we have reasons for hope that we can build on, and we have things that he's said where we can say, look, like, based on what you said, it sounds like you agree with us, and so this is what we need you to do. It does seem like his interest in closing Rikers may come from a genuine place of like recognizing it as a site that has, violated the human rights of New Yorkers and people of color for generations. So we have some of that good stuff, and then we've got some stuff that we're really keeping an eye on. We're going to have to push him to say, if we stand against abusive law enforcement when it's policing, we have to have the same stance when it's correction officers. And we need to be really clear that, like, if we're trying to close Rikers by 2027, if we have a real commitment to do that, we have to move the pieces that will get us there, including the decarceration and the replacement borough jails.
Dave, did you want to say anything in closing before we get ousted from our breakout room here?
Yeah, I would just echo some of the points that Sarita has made, that if you think of $447,000 a year, if you think of the state prison, I think it's about 50 or 60,000 a year to house somebody in the state prison. So there's no reason why we should spend that much money housing people in jail. And the second point I'd like to make is that Sarita said that 96% of cases, basically what they do is they put them in jail and they keep them there until they plead guilty to a lesser plea. I mean, 96% never get the trial. So it's just a system to basically punish people who can't afford bail and plead guilty many times to a charge that they're not guilty of. So that's what I'd like to close on.
Thank you, Dave.
And Janice also mentioned that Lafayette Presbyterian Church has signed on to close Rikers efforts as well. So that's great.
Yes, thank you so much. We've been so grateful for the support of the faith community, because I think it does, to be able to have these conversations in a frame really of the moral imperative is really important. And so I want to thank the Justice Ministries and New York City Presbytery for the really long running partnership, and hope that there'll be opportunities for more of that. And in terms of, there will be a lot of ways to get involved with our advocacy work. It's often very evolving based on the current situation. So it might be that Eric Adams gets into office and makes a statement and we need to react to that. So there's things that we're building towards long-term, like educating city council members and doing community education. Those are always things that we want to be doing. And community education could include, speaking to your congregations if you have a group that might want to gather and learn more about this. So that's always long running, but there's also sort of, things that we need to respond to. So I hope that after the session, it will be possible to share my contact information for anyone who wants to join our mailing list, sign on officially to our campaign and get on that update list so that you can be looped into, sort of the time sensitive actions, or, the sort of present actions as they come up. But I'm just really grateful that folks were able to spend the time this morning talking.
I encourage more congregations to go ahead and sign up.
And I'll put my email in the chat, and I can send the presentation also to Charmaine to circulate, but you can reach me at that email address. And if your congregation wants to sign on, I can send you basically our sign on letter, which is pretty basic and emphasizes the points that we talked about today.
And just so everybody knows, Sarita's presentation has been recorded, and we're going to put that up on Presbytery's YouTube channel as soon as possible. So, and we'll continue to push out information on our Facebook page and through our bi-weekly newsletter. So bi-monthly, sorry, newsletter.
Thank
Charmaine
you.
would freak if she thought she had to do one twice a week. I think we should leave and go back to the main room now because we're reaching that witching hour of the end of our time together. And thanks again, Dave, for organizing this, and Sarita for giving us this great information and motivation to become more involved. And so I'll see you all back in the meeting room.
Thank you so much.